everyone, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. If you saw my last video where I introduced my Roses Are Red Dynamic Duo stencil designs, you'll know what I'm about to do in this video because I teased it. I'm going to take those stencil designs from two-dimensional cookies to 3D and show you how to create this lovely heart-shaped Valentine's cookie box, perfect for filling with Valentine's candies or other mini cookies. Now, if you're watching this video after Valentine's Day, no worries, because this heart-shaped box also works wonderfully for Mother's Day, anniversaries, weddings, bridal showers, you name it. Again, it makes use of my stencil sets, which is advantageous for a couple of reasons. 3D work is complicated just in the very shaping and baking of the pieces. We've got two curvy pieces here that are a little bit complicated. So in using my stencil sets for the decorating part of the project, you're going to speed up that part of the process considerably as opposed to piping the entire project. The other thing is, if you've watched my videos for any period of time, you know that I've done heart-shaped boxes before. Well, this is a similar structure, but I'm going to show you a way to adapt it to many different box sizes. In those past videos, my box size was always constrained by the 6-inch cake pan that I baked the sides of the box around. And I'm going to show you a quick tip that allows you to reshape and reform the box sides to almost any heart shape. So it's going to make this project a little bit more adaptable. So let's talk now about what we'll need for this project. It's a 5-cookie project consisting of a base and a lid that are the exact same sizes. And I'll have the exact dimensions listed in the video. So if I misspeak here, refer to what's in the video or the video description. You'll also need one smaller heart cut with this cutter that will be placed on top of the lid to make the lid itself dimensional. The lid itself could be a pretty cookie even without the base too. So if you want to shortcut this project, maybe just make the lid and skip the base altogether. Now the bottom of the box again is going to be comprised of that same big heart, but in addition it's going to have two curvy box sides that are formed by baking strips of dough over a 6-inch cake pan. So to cut all these pieces you need a few things. You need that 6-inch cake pan I mentioned. You also need a heart that is about 1 inch shy of the big heart on all dimensions. So 1 inch shorter and 1 inch narrower, that we're going to be shaping those strips of dough around. We're going to be shaping the sides of the box around this piece here in particular to create the curve. And you want to make sure it's just a little bit smaller than the base of the box so that when we put it together, it actually fits on the base. So you'll need a heart cutter of about that size. As I mentioned, you're also going to need a big heart and a small heart. One note on these heart cutters, it's useful for this project to use a set that is a nested set. That way all the heart shapes are the same shape as opposed to borrowing hearts from different sets or from different companies. So if you can find a nice nested heart set that ranges the spectrum from about 5.5 inches on down to what's closer to 2 to 3, that would be ideal. This set was custom made for me a while ago and isn't for sale, but there are other nested sets that are available. Atico is one brand you might check into, and I'll have additional sources listed in the video description. Now, for determining the length of dough that you need to cut for the sides, you'll also need a string. I've got dental floss here to determine how much dough you need to cut, and I'll show you how this comes into play a bit later. So that comprises the things we need to make the cookies. And you'll need dough, of course. I'll be working with my gingerbread dough, but you can also formulate sugar cookie dough for 3D baking, and I have a whole nother video that talks about how to do that. Now, onto the decorating part. We're going to largely be stenciling it once we ice the cookies, so some royal icing is involved, of course. We will be stenciling, and for that you'll need my Dynamic Duos Roses Are Red set. We're just going to use the background set, not the message and frame set here. Primarily the background stencil within the background set, which consists of this dotted pattern with ribbons laid across it. And we'll also be borrowing heavily from the roses in the foreground stencil. So picking up various forms of this piece here to decorate the sides of the box and also to embellish the top. And that stencil set is available on my partner's site, confectioncouturestencils.com. That link will also be in the video description. For applying those stencils, holding them down flush against the cookie, I need various things. We'll try to use the stencil genie, but I think it might be too small to fit around my big cookie. So if that's the case, we'll use some magnets to weigh down the stencils. And if the stencil is lifting in any particular areas, As I stencil, I always apply my trussing needle to keep that stencil laying perfectly flush. Any areas where the stencil isn't flush is an opportunity for airbrush coloring to go underneath. As needed, we might also need my quadrant masking tool. Let me give you a better look at this. That's just for masking off parts of the stencil that I don't want to get on the cookie. So for instance, when I'm airbrushing that rose onto the cookie, I might want to mask off these hearts that I don't want to get on it. This piece is really handy, also available on my partner's site. We'll be airbrushing by and large, with the exception of adding some royal icing flowers and also some modeling chocolate ribbons and fondant ribbons as well. So you'll need airbrushes, an airbrush system. I got my compressor on the ground. I'm using 6 colors for this project, which will be listed in the video description, and I've got them preloaded in guns. I've just got 3 here, but I've got 3 set off to the side. Then for final embellishments on the cookie project, we're gonna want some fondant. We're gonna be wrapping the entire base of the box with a long strip of fondant and then airbrushing it, and then applying fondant appliques, which are nothing more than rolled fondant, rolled very, very thin, airbrushed with some sort of pattern. In this case, we'll be using that rose pattern, trimmed out, and then placed on the cookie. These are some that I did before that are already dry. We'll be using these on the lid of the box as well. As further embellishments, little royal icing roses. I have a whole nother video about how to do those, so we won't talk about those here. I've done them in assorted sizes. These big guys were done with a 101 tip. The small roses were done with a 101S. And these buds were done with a 101S as well, just not as fully formed as the roses that I just showed you. I'll probably be using the 2 smaller sizes, using the 101S tip on this project. And I also have some bows on top of this, which I do with modeling chocolate. Looks a lot like fondant. It's more tasty, so I like to use it whenever possible. But the disadvantage is it doesn't dry quite as firm as fondant does. So for fondant appliques, it never will get quite as brittle, and it's a little harder to handle. It will actually misshape in the warmth of your hand even after it's set for a while. So for pieces that I want to maintain their rigidity, I'll tend to use fondant, as in these fondant appliques. But if I'm bending the dough and I want it to stay flexible for a period of time, then I'll use modeling chocolate. So I think that covers 99% of what we'll need for this project. I do have some additional royal icing needs that'll come into play as we do beaded borders and also a star border around the base of the box, and also icing glue to stick some of the fondant appliques and other elements onto the project. But with that said, let's move on to how I did the curved pieces and how you can adapt them to different size heart boxes, because that's pretty interesting. Okay, so in this segment, I want to show you how to make these curvy box sides. Again, cutting of these flat pieces is no big deal. I roll them about 3/16 of an inch thick to 1/8 of an inch. I want to keep them pretty low profile, not 1/4 of an inch, because I want this box to look streamlined from the sides. I am going to be actually showing you how to use a clever double baking process to adapt these sides to almost any size you want. But we're gonna first make the size that I'm using for this particular box, which again is about 1 inch narrower and 1 inch shorter than the base of the box. And that'll create a curve that looks something like this when we're done. So the first step is actually rolling the dough to the desired thickness, and the thinner the better. If you've watched my video on how to adapt dough for 3D baking, you'll see that you'll get a lot less cracking the thinner you roll the dough, even if you don't adapt the recipe at all. So we're gonna roll this about 1/8 of an inch thick, and then basically cut a strip about 1 1/4 inches tall and long enough to wrap over half of the pan. Now I can't wrap the dough all the way around the heart-shaped pan and bake it like so, because the dough will just slump in the oven. So I always have to bake things that I want to have vertical on their sides, if you will, so that they don't slump off the piece, and then piece them together later. So we'll be baking 2 mirror image sides in this same vein. I'm just going to show you one. Okay, so I'm rolling to 1/8 of an inch thick, as I mentioned before. The key here is to work on a silicone mat that's well floured, because we will need to lift this piece up and off the work surface onto a 6-inch cake pan. Now you could start with a pin that has rolling guides like this one to make sure it's a nice uniform thickness all the way across. However, these guides are 3/16 of an inch thick, so I need to continue to roll it a little bit thinner with this other rolling pin. Now, before I cut it, I want to make sure I can easily move the dough off the surface. So I'm sliding my ruler underneath it. And now I need to figure out how much length to cut. So I'm taking that string I mentioned before and wrapping it around the cutter. And it looks like I'll need at least 7.5, 7 inches, but I'm going to even cut it longer. It won't hurt to have a longer piece now. We can always trim it down to size later. And as a first step, we're going to be shaping it over the 6-inch pan. This is just going to give it an initial curve. We're going to shape it tighter around the cookie cutter so that it conforms to the actual size we want a bit later. Cutting a guideline and then marking 2 points, 1¼ inch off that guideline on either end. That'll mark the height of the box. And then cutting a second line. And now because I ran my ruler underneath it before and well floured the surface, I should be able to lift this easily onto my floured cake pan. You don't need to flour the cake pan, but it does help get the dough off a little bit more easily once it bakes. Cutting off excess down here at the bottom, which can cause the dough to overexpand and crack just by pulling the dough down. And now we're going to nestle it in this other cake pan and tuck some foil around it to keep that pan upright in the oven, and it'll bake its normal baking time. It was in there about 8 to 10 minutes. And as soon as it comes out, you want to run a sharp paring knife, thin bladed knife underneath it to disengage the dough, otherwise it'll stick. And we also need to remove it quickly because we want to shape it to the actual size around this other cookie cutter. So while it's warm, the dough will be malleable, but as soon as it cools, it'll set up. So we have to work quickly here. And I do want to prop that dough against the cutter because it tends to want to pop open. And that way we'll make sure it's the size we want. And we just repeat this process and do a mirror image of it to complete the other box side. So now I've got this guy propped and cooling. I've got a little bit of extra tail at the end, which is no big deal. I'd rather have more dough than less dough because I'm going to trim it all later. You just don't want to be short. And I've got it propped while it's cooling. You can use anything tall and narrow. It doesn't need to be food coloring containers, but you just want to keep that dough pressed in against the side of the cutter. When that's cooled down, I'll be able to pick it up and trim it. Before I do that, I want to show you how once it's cooled down, I'm going to reheat it yet again. That'll get the dough malleable, and then I'm going to shape it over an even smaller cutter just to indicate how you can really adapt this project to almost any size. So you can take it any which direction. So it needs not more than a couple minutes in the oven before it gets soft and malleable again. And as before, you want to wrap it immediately while it's still warm and prop it. I'm just doing the exact same thing as before, just around a smaller cutter with a sharper curve. So this should demonstrate that you can get just about any size heart you want. Of course, we'd want to trim off that big tail at the end, but that's all there really is to it. Once the box sides are cool, we're ready to cut them down to size and to make sure they fit well with each other on the base. I've got that one side done, so let's work on the other. I know I've got to cut off about 1 inch because it was super long to start, but I'm going to do so gradually with a paring knife. I don't want to cut off the entire inch in one fell swoop or I could crack the entire piece. So you want to shave here, and you want to make sure you also periodically check its fit against the other box side as you cut because you don't want to overcut either. So let me check it. And what I'm looking for is that it looks like a heart from the top, that it's symmetric, and that there's a uniform amount of distance between the sides and the edge of the base. And it looks great as far as that goes, but I do have a pretty big opening at the top and also at the bottom. So I'm going to turn now to a microplaner to do some finer filing to get tighter fits at those corners. What I'm doing here is mitering the edge, and by mitering, I mean filing at a 45-degree angle. That way, the corner is going to come together very, very tightly without a lot of space in between. Those two angles on either side of the box will fit together nearly seamlessly if I do this correctly. And you can see that I did so at the base. That point at the bottom of the heart is a really nice tight fit, which will make wrapping the fondant around it that much easier later. Okay, with the tricky box sides all curved and cooled, we're ready to begin decorating. I'm going to start with the lid actually, and this is where we're headed. It's going to be a double-decker lid. The dotted and striped pattern on the background is done with a background stencil in my Roses Are Red Dynamic Duo set. And the little heart on top is also airbrushed and stenciled, but it uses the foreground element, the rose foreground element in that same background set. One thing to note before we start airbrushing is you want to make sure that your cookies are iced and dry all the way through because we will be applying a bit of pressure. I iced the bottom cookie in a light pink. I left a little hole in the middle. I didn't ice the whole thing because it's going to be covered with that smaller cookie on top, and that saves a little bit of time. And the cookie on top, I just iced plain white. Okay, I want to start by airbrushing the white heart that's going to go on top of the box lid first. I've isolated the rose element in my foreground stencil and used my quadrant masking tool to mask off the areas of the stencil that I don't want to get airbrush coloring through. So I just have isolated the rose. I'm going to do 5 colors here, a pink, a light blue, a light green, a dark green, and a maroon, starting light to dark, airbrushing at a 90-degree angle to prevent underspray, and always holding down that stencil with magnets or trussing needle to keep it from flying up and getting underspray. And that looks great. I've got a nice sharp stencil as a result. Now I'm ready to move on to the bigger cookie that forms the base of the lid. It's too big to use the stencil genie to hold the stencil down, so I'm using magnets to do so here. And I'm going to do this in 2 colors, a light blue in the dots and a dark brown in the ribbons. Again, holding that airbrush at a 90-degree angle and using my trussing needle to really hold down that stencil as I'm airbrushing in particular areas. Without the benefit of the stencil genie, I need that trussing needle for sure here to prevent underspray. Moving on to the brown, you want to airbrush along the length of stripes to prevent underspray. If you airbrush crosswise, you'll get more underspray, but that looks great. And again, you'll notice I didn't ice the middle of the cookie because that's going to be covered with the white cookie. Now, I missed some coloring here at the edges because the icing rolls over and the cookie's a little bit large, so I'm just going to paint in a little airbrush coloring there to fill out those ribbons. Now, looking at the finished cookie lid, once again, I've got these modeling chocolate ribbons on it, and they were also airbrushed. So while I've got the airbrush out, let's talk about those modeling chocolate ribbons or bows. Basically, I roll out modeling chocolate through a pasta machine, cut it into thin strips, and then fold it back on itself. I've got a whole nother video on that. And now I'm just lightly shading them with light blue airbrush coloring to finish them off, spraying at a distance. Okay, so we finished airbrushing the base of the lid and the top of the lid. We also shaded the modeling chocolate bows with a little bit of light blue. And again, as a reminder, I have a whole nother video about how to make modeling chocolate ribbons and bows. So jump on over to that video for those details. We have yet to make some fondant appliques, these pieces here, to give more dimension to the lid. But I want to first get the borders down on these 2 cookies so they're completely dry. So by the time we have all of the pieces ready, we can assemble it without messing up the borders. I'm going to do a white beaded border here, a slightly bigger bead than the dots on the back of the cookie. So there's some difference between the 2 that looks better than having them the exact same size. And I'm going to do a pale pink border here to tie into the pale pink background on the bottom cookie. Again, some color continuity across the cookies makes for a more cohesive end design. Once we get those borders down and dried, we'll make those fondant appliques. So for beadwork, I use icing of beadwork consistency naturally. It's a relatively loose icing that forms a nice rounded bead without any peaks, as you can see here. If you're getting peaks, then just thin the icing a little bit, or if your dots are merging into each other, the icing could be a little bit too loose, so try thickening the icing just a touch, or just spacing the dots a little bit further apart. It's best always to practice on paper first and get a sense of the rhythm and spacing before you apply dots to a cookie, but this is looking pretty good. Finish that border in white, we'll let that dry. I'm going to move on and do a light pink border now here on the heart. Exact same icing consistency and same process. That's looking great. We're almost done here. We're going to let that dry before we decorate on top. And while they're drying, I'm going to go ahead and make these fondant appliques, as I mentioned before. The first step is to roll out fondant through a pasta machine to about 1/16 of an inch thick, and then I'm simply airbrushing over it using the same element on the foreground stencil that I used on the little white heart. Okay, so we finished airbrushing on the fondant and it's still pliable. I'm going to be using some of these fondant pieces trimmed out on the sides of the box, as you can see there. And in order for them to conform to the sides of the box, the fondant needs to stay flexible. So I'm going to set a couple of them aside here on this cardboard, covered with plastic loosely. So hopefully by the time we get to the box, they're still going to be pliable enough for me to cut out and shape on the box. For those fondant appliques, however, that are going on the lid, I want them to extend off the side of the lid a little bit. So I do want to trim them out and dry them ideally for a couple of hours until they're firm enough to pick up and handle, or even overnight. So I've got some pre-made that we'll use on the lid. I just want to show you the cutting process. The trimming out process is the same, regardless of whether they're going on the side of the box or on the lid. You want to trim the fondant while it's pliable, and then for the lid, set it aside to dry so they're not pliable, and then put them under plastic or use them right away if you're going to be putting them on the box sides. So for trimming out the fondant, I use the tip of a sharp, thin-bladed paring knife. I start with big cuts and then work my way in towards all the detailed areas. Sometimes I pat the edges of the fondant with the side of the knife if I've got any rough, frayed edges, and that tends to smooth them out. And then again, set it aside to dry if you're going to be using it on the lid. I'm going to move on to assembling the lid now using thick royal icing glue to adhere the white cookie to the pink heart. The thicker the icing is, the faster it'll dry and the less the pieces will skid around as you're decorating. Now I've got some previously dried fondant appliques that I'm going to position in place. The beauty of working with these is I can arrange them without gluing them down first, get a design I like, and then commit them to the cookie with royal icing glue as I'm doing here. I'm going to put these two on to look as if they're extensions of the stenciled rose pattern on top. And now I'm going to add some modeling chocolate bows. I definitely want to add one here to cover that little spot in the stenciling, but also to integrate with the blue bow that's been stenciled onto the white cookie. I want this modeling chocolate bow to look as if it's an extension of what's been stenciled on that white cookie. That looks great. Now I'm moving on to smaller elements, my tiny roses. I generally lay things out from big to small, filling in gaps with smaller pieces as I get closer to done with the design. Moving on to smaller buds, we're going to put some down here, and we're also going to work roses across the top. Again, I'm trying to make this look as if it's a seamless cascade of roses and bows that works its way across the piece. Now, to hide the seams at the bottom of the roses, I'm adding some leaves using a Wilton number 349 leaf tip to start. It's the smallest of the leaf tips that I have, and then I'll move possibly on to a bigger Atico 349 leaf tip. But perhaps this Wilton one will do just fine, and that looks great. Okay, our lid is all done. I'm going to work now on the bottom. And I do not ice the base of the bottom because when I do, the whole box tends to look a little too tall. So it's just going to be a bare naked cookie onto which we're going to glue the sides with icing. And then I'm going to wrap the whole perimeter with a sheet of fondant, a little ribbon of fondant. Now you could dip these cookies in royal icing separately and then piece them together. I've done something similar to that in a jewelry cuff project that I made, but it's a lot more complex. And as you can see, this project is already quite time consuming. So I'm going to accelerate the process by wrapping with fondant. You could also use modeling chocolate. So the first step is making sure the sides are filed nicely to fit. We did that earlier. I just want to double check that before committing them to the cookie, and then we'll glue them down, measure out how much fondant we need, and get cutting. Okay, so I'm ready to stick them down with some royal icing glue. This time I'm using brown glue to match the cookie dough. Generally, that's a good rule to follow. Match the glue to whatever it is you're gluing it onto. That way it's less likely to show. And less is more here. You don't want to have a ton because we don't want it peeking out on the inside of the box or on the outside. I am, though, going to reinforce this seam in the center because there's a bit of a gap there. And then when I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead and clean out the excess icing that's smooshed out on the outside and also on the inside using my trussing needle. Once that's done, we need to determine how long a piece of fondant we need. And to do that, I'm back to my dental floss or string, wrapping it around the box, marking off where they meet, and then I'm going to measure out that piece. And it's about 18 inches of fondant. And again, it needs to be not quite 1 1/4 inches tall. 1 1/4 inches is the top of the box, but the cookie tends to curve in towards the top, and the fondant won't make good contact at the very top if I cut it exactly a 1 1/4 inch. So I'm going to cut it about 1 1/8 inches, and I think that's going to fit the box a little bit better without having to bend that fondant over the top edge of the box. Fondant's been rolled to slightly thicker than what I roll it to for fondant appliques. I don't want it too thin because if there's any irregularity to the box sides underneath, it's likely to show through a thin piece of fondant. So I'm starting to wrap it. You'll notice I started wrapping at the center of the piece of ribbon so that the seam comes together at the top of the box, and I'm applying it to the cookie with a little bit of corn syrup, applying the corn syrup gradually as I go. If you apply it to the strip all at once and then try to lift the strip up, sometimes the strip can fall back on itself and get stuck to the corn syrup. So it's best to apply it in stages gradually. That looks great. And now I'm ready to airbrush it. I want to give it a little color. I want to bring in that blue that's in the ribbons on the box side. And here I'm shading at a distance using that light blue airbrush coloring. And again, I want to be at a distance because I don't want to get a heavy concentration or saturation of color anywhere on the box sides. That looks great. I'm just going to decorate one side of the box because it's a rather labor-intensive process. The process, though, is the same on the other side of the box. I'm going to start by marking off where the brown ribbons would meet the bottom of the box if they were to roll over the sides of the box, because we're going to be applying some ribbons to the sides to make it look as if they're running up and connecting with those on the lid. Turning back to my background stencil and some rolled fondant, I'm going to airbrush just the brown bands on it, and we'll cut those out and apply those to the box sides. So again, this piece of fondant's a little bit thinner. This is now closer to what I usually roll it to the number 4 setting, which is about 1/16 of an inch thick. What went down on the box sides originally was more like 1/8 of an inch thick. But here I don't want to add too much thickness to what's already on the sides of the boxes, or it might make the box just too fat. So we want to keep these pieces as streamlined as possible from here on out. Again, applying them with a little bit of corn syrup. I don't use icing glue here because it's too thick and will show lumps beneath the fondant. So I want to use corn syrup or glucose because it spreads nice and thin and it won't create any lumpiness underneath the fondant. Just trimming it off at the base here with a sharp paring knife, matching up those ribbons from bottom to top so it looks like they're tying up the sides of the box. That looks great. Now additionally, I want some little rose elements here so it looks like the roses are actually also growing up the sides of the box and connecting with what's on top. So I've taken one of those fondant appliques that's still pliable and stuck it up with a little bit of corn syrup. Now I've got a big gap at the top and also obviously at the bottom of the box, and I do want to finish those off. So I'm going to do a simple beaded border around the top, again using icing of beadwork consistency just as I did around the edges of the lid, but starting first to close off that seam at the top. And now I'll go around the top. This dot work also mimics, as I said, what's on the lid, and I like to repeat design elements across the piece just for more cohesiveness in overall look. Now I'm turning to a number 24 tip and doing a shell border at the bottom to fill out that remaining gap. I like to use dark colors at the bottom of a piece because it tends to visually weight things towards the bottom as opposed to putting a really bright light color down there. So I'm using brown. That looks great. And again, I just repeat this process on the other side. Okay, so we finished the lid and we finished half of the box bottom, but because of the magic of video, I'm able to cut to a completely finished box to show you what that bottom might look like if I had done the whole thing. So let me push those working pieces aside and show you this baby I put together earlier. Here I did attach a fondant applique in between the two, but I didn't put any rose here. I opted though to decorate more fully on the other side because it only had one ribbon. So I did use some of the royalizing roses at the base here, but the process of putting this together is exactly the same. This side was just a little more time consuming because of course I had to cut out all those individual fondant appliques. Now I don't happen to have any mini cookies here for filling the box, but I do happen to have the next best thing, which are some St. Louis artisan chocolates. So I'm going to take off the lid. You can see how nice and clean the inside of this box is because I did not use an overabundance of glue. So I don't really need to line it with anything else other than the cookies or the candies in this case that are going to go inside. So as I'm doing that and readying this little gift for my Valentine, I just want to remind you that I've got these same stencils in use in another video that shows them on 2D cookies. So if this 3D project's a little too ambitious for you, jump on over there. And if you're watching this video, it's something other than Valentine's Day, just imagine this makes a great wedding gift, anniversary gift, hostess gift, you name it. Till next video, live sweetly.